Hello. I was on the phone last week to a friend of mine talking about the strategic and Napoleonic games. He's recently purchased the remake of War and Peace, which looks very nice. I used to have the Avalon Hill version many moons ago, which I sold on, and it was okay. It didn't really tick all the boxes for me, and I was intrigued by the new release, but not at a sufficiently high level to actually buy it. And I was talking to Steve, and he mentioned about he'd just been reading about the Hexasim Napoleonic a strategic game, which is Napoleon against Europe, I think it's called. And he thought, well, that looks quite interesting as well. And thought, well, maybe I bought the wrong game or something. And I went to look it up, and I was aware of the game, and it did look quite nice. I'm aware that it's not currently available. I think there was a second edition, and there was an update pack which they produced for the owners of the first edition. But there's a couple of playthrough videos. I think Stuka Joe did a very good one, and it does look quite a nice game. And I was thinking, well, what have I got that fills that particular sort of niche in the market? And I got a copy of the Napoleonic Wars, the GMT, which you can do 2-player. I think it probably shines with more players. And the only other game I've got on the same sort of scale really is Age of Napoleon. This was done by Phalanx games. This is 2003, and I've had a couple of Phalanx games in the past. I've got their redo of The House Divided, which was essentially a blinged up version of the original, which I've played a bit with my son. He quite enjoys it. Possibly a bit overly long for what it does, but it's still a fun game. And I also picked up the Ted Racer World War I game, which was sort of crazy cheap. It was like £14 on Amazon. I think I had a £4 credit note from something, so it cost me like 10 quid. And I played it a couple of times, and it's actually not a bad game at all. I mean, it's not Paths of Glory, but then you don't always want to play Paths of Glory. Sometimes you want a slightly lighter game. Maybe you've got a person who hasn't played so many games before, not so familiar with the sort of CTGs. So I got back into looking at Age of Napoleon, because I remember always being a little bit confused by the movement rules. I don't know why, but I think it's because there's a distinction between movement rating and movement allowance, and I'll explain that. I'm probably going to do like a little example of play, because I think the kind of penny finally dropped. It's only taken 18 years after all. But I'm reminded what a great game it is. I have played it a few times. I'm just doing a little solo run through, just to remind myself of the rules and the sort of sequence of play and everything. But at its heart, it is a CGG game. Number of different, not your traditional sort of CDG type card. So there's no number in the corner which dictates who can and can't be activated. You essentially just discard a card to move an army. So you have from 1805 to 1815. There's essentially 6 impulses each turn, 4 non-winter and potentially two winter turns. And you can move armies around the map. It's got quite an attractive map, and you discard a card to move an army. So it doesn't really matter what the card says. But of course you are forfeiting the opportunity to use that card for its specific use. So there are cards for a diplomacy. There's cards to assist you in battle, to give you modifiers and to give you additional strengths. There's cards to help you with the attrition of your troops by using depots. I think there's a Scorched Earth card that can be played to the detriment of the opposing player to make his attrition worse. So you're always trying to decide, do I really want to make that move, or do I want to save that card for later? You can also intercept an enemy force that also requires the playing of a card. So you're always mindful of your card is your sort of key currency, if you like. And the number that you get is dependent on the number of nations that are currently active on your side. So for example, I think France always gets 4 cards for having France active. I think it's 4. There's a very useful 2-sided player aid, and that's really all you need to play the game once you know the rules. It's actually 5 cards, so you get 5 cards for having France, and potentially if Spain was pro-French, that'll give you another 2 cards. And then there's a number of minors, and you get a card for each 3 minors, and it's maxed out at 10, so you can never have more than 10 cards. But yeah, it plays very nicely. It's you can get a minor victories and major victories by the French are in the driving seat. They're trying to cause the surrender of a number of the major powers, Austria, Russia, and Britain, and ultimately to not lose the game by the Allied forces entering into French territory towards the end of the game. So this is just a very quick snapshot of what I think of the game. For me, it's a keeper, because I don't think there's anything else that really does anything similar to this at the moment. Pretty hard to get hold of. I think there were some copies available on the second-hand market, but only in Europe. I don't think there's any UK-based second-hand items. There was a few minor changes, so there is a revised rule book and scenario book. There's also an updated set of cards. I think maybe half a dozen cards changed, so that they did do a revised card set, which I managed to get hold of. Having said that, if you sleeve your cards, there is a display or a printout of the cards that were changed, so you can just literally print them out and then just slide the modified text over the existing cards if you keep them sleeved, which you probably wanted to do anyway. So there was talk at one time of doing a new edition, but I think I'm right in saying that has actually fallen off the bus now. I don't think that's going to happen. I think Renaud Verlac, I think that was the designer's name. Renaud Verlac, yeah, he's the designer, and he actually answered a question of mine on it the other day. I posted a question on Board Game Geek, which he answered on the same day. So the guy's still around. He's still an active designer, but I don't think he's active regarding doing a 3rd edition of this. Maybe he's working on something similar but different. I'll show you the map and the pieces, and I'll also just walk you through my understanding of movement rating and movement allowance, and how the interaction with units becoming attrited or being subject to march attrition, and how that affects their movement rating, and that has an effect on the ability of the enemy to intercept or to withdraw, because you can only intercept or withdraw if you can match the target's movement rating, and that changes depending on how far that target moves and where it goes. So that's probably enough for a quick summary, and I will take some footage of the map. Okay, so here's the map. I'll just give you a little look around it before I start on the example of play. So currently in the game I was playing just recently, the Allies had managed to neutralise Spain with a view to potentially at some point being able to persuade them to join the Allied faction. You have a number of diplomatic cards which can allow you to change the allegiance of some of the minor and major powers in the game. So that's played in the diplomatic phase of the game. If I just look at the sequence of play, you can see that the diplomacy phase is the first thing that you do on a turn. Then you have the insurrection phase, where the Allied player is trying to form or to create insurrection events in some of the French dominions, and the French player was trying to crush insurrections that were started on the previous turn. And that's when you would have used the last of your cards that you were saving, and then you go into the strategy phase, when you actually get cards for the next part of the turn. So you would then discard any which you didn't use and draw in your hand. There's no saving of cards for next turn. You actually have to discard anything that was left. And you get some reinforcements, and then you go on to the campaign phase, which is the sort of meat and potatoes of the game. And this is where, depending on who goes first, and I think on the first, from 1805 to 1810, I think the French player goes first, and then from 1811 to 1815, the Allied player goes first. And that's where you get into moving and fighting with the armies. And then after all that's finished, when everyone's passed, or you've had the full 6 impulses, you then do a surrender phase. And essentially, if you are occupying the other nation's capital, you can force them to go neutral. And then potentially further on down the road, you might be able to swing them back to your side. Oops, it's just and then it's the winter attrition phase. So anything that's a stack of 3 or more core, that will involve a check on the attrition table, and then you check for victory. So this is just the rest of the player aid. The strategy chart tells you about the card draw. You're always going to get at least 6 cards, but you can't get more than 10. So dependent on the sort of diplomatic situation, that will determine how many cards both sides get. The reinforcement, you'll have a mobilisation limit, so if the British have got 2 core on the map, they can't raise another one. If they had no core on the map, they can only deploy 1, because that's the maximum you can add on any one particular turn. So you see the French could actually deploy 5 core on the same turn, but not if that took them beyond the 10 core limit for mobilisation. The other side of the play aid, you have march attrition. So depending on the number of core, that's on the top, from 1 to 8. You can never have more than 8, because 8 is the maximum seniority of any one leader, which is Napoleon. We've got a helicopter flying over. So you roll the dice, compare that to the number of core moving, and it will tell you how many core are lost to march attrition. So if they're fresh, i.e. if they're on the fresh side, then the only damage is they get flipped over. Once they're spent on the other side, you will actually lose the core, which will go into the surrender box, white flag, until the following turn. So they won't be available to come back as reinforcements until the following turn. Those that die from march attrition, from winter attrition, are actually permanent losses, as they are also in march attrition in the winter. So you check for march attrition and if you're doing it in the winter they would be permanent losses. The battle results table is quite simple. Essentially adding up your total strengths and rolling a d6. If you're fighting on home turf, you'll get a bonus for each corps fighting. So you're mindful of the column breaks. And then if the person with the most losses inflicted on the enemy wins the battle and inflicts one more extra loss. If the numbers are tied, you have a tiebreaker, and you use the TBM, the tiebreak modifier result, to see who wins the battle that way. So combat is quite straightforward, but it is quite interesting how it works. The winter attrition. So if you've got 3 or more corps in one space, you're essentially rolling on this table, and you want high numbers because low numbers will result in permanent losses. And there's quite a few modifiers there for whether you're in friendly or enemy areas. If you're spent from activity during the last year, and there's a few card plays that can affect you as well. So that's probably a useful quick zip through the rules. Here is the turn record track, so 1805 1815. So we have 4 non-winter impulses and then 2 winter. So you are going to incur additional risks of marching in the winter, which will give you permanent losses. A couple of other markers there for various cards for events which may happen during the game. And here's the map, so get some idea of the scale. Russia, Austria, Prussia, currently neutral. Russia's fighting for the Allies. There should be a flag in the Austrian capital. There are some corps in. Once you've played the Admiralty, I think it's the Admiralty event, you get to place Nelson there, and that now signifies that the British player can start making naval moves around the map. So that's quite important for some flexibility. So here we have the counters, 3 numbers and a leader. So there you'll see Napoleon. So from left to right we've got strength, then we've got the movement, and then we've got the seniority. And it's always the most senior guy who by default is the guy in charge of the army. So Napoleon can move around with 8 corps, and you just add up all the strengths if they're involved in combat, if you choose to use them all. And so in this example you can see down here in Bayern we have a smaller Austrian army controlled by Karl, and the supporting Russian army with Tolly. So what could happen here, and this is where you need to bear in mind that the 4, the middle number, is the movement rating. So if you discard any card to move, that movement rating of 4 is converted into 4 movement points. It costs you 1 to move into each area. It also costs you 1 to engage in combat. So in the current position, Napoleon could move 1, 2, 3 and move in and attack Karl with the 4th movement point. That would be legal. As it stands at the moment, Karl would not be able to withdraw from combat, which is free. You don't have to pay for that, you can just declare it when the guy moves in. He could withdraw from combat if his movement rating was the same or higher than the attacker. Now at the moment it looks as though it's lower. However, moving corps suffer attrition as they enter their 3rd and their 4th areas. So what would happen here is that these guys, as they entered their 3rd area, they would flip over. So they'd be going 1, 2, flip over, become spent in there. They've still got the 4 movement points, they don't lose the movement point because they've become spent. What's happened is that their movement rating has gone down by 1. They're getting a bit tired, they're a bit slower moving, so they're more prone for the enemy to get out of the way or for the enemy to intercept them. And that's a concept which I think I struggled with for quite a while. And you can see here the interesting options that gives, because now Karl has got the option to withdraw, which is free, because his movement rating now matches that of Napoleon. Equally, if he wanted to use a card, he could reinforce Karl by playing a card to move Tolly and a number of corps into support Karl, because the movement rating of Tolly matches that of Napoleon. And it was still, you'd have a combined Austrian-Russian force, and you could choose which one of those two guys was in command, because they've both got the same seniority, but the total number of corps involved defensively could only be 6. It's not 12, it's not 6 each, because you have one overall commander. So that's one scenario which is quite interesting. The other thing that could happen, of course, is that if Napoleon, if Wellington's in the UK, if Napoleon was here, now that doesn't look very different, but of course it's significantly different, because Napoleon's only 2 away from Karl, so he won't suffer attrition when he moves into the second space. Still got 4 movement points, but he can go 1, 2. He'll pay a movement point for the battle if it takes place, but he's still fresh. So that means at the moment Karl can't withdraw from combat, or equally Tolly could not pay a card to intercept. So Karl's going to be on his own. The twist here is that there are forced march cards which are played during the campaign. I think there's 2 of these in the in the card mix. So what these do, they actually increase one friendly army's movement rating by 1. So that's the movement rating. So the important thing there is, if this card was in the hands of the allied player, he could play it to boost Karl's movement rating to 4 from 3 to allow him to withdraw, and of course he might choose to withdraw into Tolly's space, or he could just play it to withdraw into the capital, trying to defend the capital. But when you force march, you automatically become spent, so he would flip over. But of course Napoleon has only used 2 movement points now, because he's not engaged in battle, so he could continue moving. But of course if he continues moving into the 3rd space, he'll now become spent, which will mean that his movement rating will reduce to, as we saw earlier, to 3. So wherever he goes there, if he goes to attack Karl again, Karl can't run now because his movement rating is 2 compared to 3, but of course now Tolly's got the option to intercept. And if Napoleon goes for Tolly, then Tolly could choose to withdraw. So hopefully you can see from that, I think I've got that right now. It took me far too long to finally work that out, but I think that's how it's supposed to work. If someone knows different, please let me know. But I think it's a very interesting situation. It gives lots of difficult choices and decisions to make, and knowing where the forced march cards are, you know, if I've got one in my hand, then the chance of the other guy having one in his hand is pretty remote. Maybe it's in the discard pile. There are cards that allow you to trade a card from your hand with one in the discard pile. There's all these sorts of wheels within wheels, which I think makes it a fascinating game, and one that maybe has slid off the radar a little bit, and perhaps it needs to be shown a bit more love. I think it's very good. Anyway, hope that was informative.